Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we break down the latest on Pete Alonso and Roki Sasaki. We also make our Mets New Year's resolutions, go down on the farm, and of course, answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Happy New Year. Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and please subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your pods. If you'd like to drop us a review, drop us a mailbag question with that review. You can watch us on YouTube and ask mailbag questions in the comments under the show there as well. And of course, take care of one major New Year's resolution early. Get it out of the way. Please vote for the Mets Pod in the best baseball podcast category of the Sports Podcast Awards. Head over to sportspodcastawards.com. For those watching on YouTube, here's an easy QR code to get you there. All you got to do is scan this. We'll tweet it out as well for those who can't see it right now. Please and thank you so much, everybody. Joe, Happy New Year. How are you, my friend?
Happy New Year, Connor. Happy New Year to everyone listening. Doing really well. Just ready for some stuff to get moving. As we say on this show, the holidays, baseball's like one of the only sports that takes like a pseudo break during the holidays. So once we get past the new year, I think we'll start to see some action throughout the sport.
Yeah, and during that break, it leads to chatter, it leads to discourse, and I think the biggest conversation around the Mets right now is, since Sean Manaea's been signed, and really this conversation didn't even go on break. It felt like they signed Juan Soto, and everybody was like, okay, what about Pete Alonso? And that conversation has dragged on here, Joe. And now I think it's reached the point where everybody's in a little bit of a different camp. You have the people that are looking at it and going, why isn't this done? And as we always remind you on this show, I mean, sometimes it's out of your control. You make an offer that is the value of the player's market, and if they want to wait it out, that's their right to wait it out. You have the people that, quite frankly, I think are tired of waiting it out with Pete Alonso because the first base market, it's shaped around him. I mean, Christian Walker signed already. Josh Naylor got traded. Paul Goldschmidt signed. Even Josh Bell, who's going to do some DHing, but also we know plays first base, went back to the Nationals. The first base market has kind of taken shape already. And then you have people that are starting to discuss, okay, there's a couple plans here. And I think, Joe, the leak that the Mets did make a competitive offer to Teoscar Hernandez tells you that the Mets, David Stern specifically, he's not just sitting on his hands and going, well, we're waiting around to see what Pete Alonso is doing. The Mets have other ideas. They probably would like Pete back at their price and to shape this offense. But, Joe, this is kind of carried on where, I'll be honest, and I've said this over and over again, but I can't emphasize it enough. I'm glad to see the Mets not playing themselves here and letting the market develop on its own. And they have an actual hard line in the sand for Pete Alonso. As much as we love him, that is savvy negotiating and savvy GMing at the top of this organization that, quite frankly, hasn't been consistent enough in the history of this team.
It would be very easy for them just to offer Pete Alonso 5 years and $130 million or 6 years and whatever 25 times 6 is. Be very easy to do that and just wrap it up. And fans are going to be happy that like if that came out, a Jeff Passan tweet or Andy Martino tweet came out, Mets and Pete Alonso agree to a 5-year, $130 million deal. I don't think there's going to be fans in an uproar on the internet about it. They'll be happy that Pete is back. But what it comes down to is the job of David Stearns and Steve Cohen and this front office is to build the best baseball team that you can while playing within the confines of the market. Christian Walker, great defensive player, 3-time Gold Glove winner, had a good offensive season, a little older, but he gets 3 years, 60. In what world does that equate to Pete Alonso getting 5 for 130, 6 for 150? The math doesn't math. And I understand the emotions of Mets fans that love Pete Alonso. We love Pete Alonso. We want Pete Alonso back. And frankly, I think Pete Alonso is going to be back. But I see I see everyone in my mentions and I see things on Twitter and everyone's just like, well, just walk away. Why would you walk away? Just sit and wait. And if you can get Pete Alonso, great. You work other options while you're waiting, which we can get into some alternative options that the Mets could pursue. But largely, the first base market has evaporated. There's not much out there for the Mets to pivot from. So, yeah, you just kind of wait Pete out. And I think this is going to come back to the Mets in, maybe it's not 3 years, maybe it's 4 years. Got to be a little wiggle room, I think, on both sides.
Right. And the Mets here are in a position of leverage that I think a lot of fans aren't necessarily accustomed to seeing, right? I think that here's the situation with the Mets right now in this era that is really, if you're a fan of this team, you feel really good about. One, with Steve Cohen as the owner, more often than not, if a player is interested in returning, the owner in this era of Mets baseball gets last licks in negotiations because he's got the most money. So Scott Boras, his job is to get Pete Alonso the most money. Pete Alonso, it's different because some people be like, well, we watched Jacob deGrom go out the door. Jacob deGrom didn't want to be here. Sometimes it's that simple. When a guy doesn't want to be here anymore, Pete Alonso, we have all reason to believe, wants to be here. So the Mets gain leverage in that situation because if there's not a big market for him, and there hasn't been, because say the Giants really do have interest in Pete Alonso and they offer 3 years, $84 million. And Scott Boras goes, well, I'm going to go back to the Mets because that's where he wants to be and they have the most money. And the Mets go, okay, we'll match the deal. Done.
Right.
And you just gave a 3-year deal to a guy that once upon a time, not that long ago, was getting 5 or 6 years. So that's the power of having that kind of financial pull in an environment that players want to be in. And that's a really unique stance for the Mets. The second point of leverage for the Mets is they're not in a position like the Yankees necessarily were in, or like the Astros were necessarily in. The Mariners, obviously, you could talk about them like that. If the Mets lost Pete Alonso today, and listen, we're not overlooking Pete Alonso. We all want him back. Mark Mantos can move over to first, and then you pivot to different options, whether that's you got Alex Bregman on a deal that you weren't expecting. You take on the rest of Nolan Arenado's contract, or you let the young guys figure out third base, and then you make a move later on. And I know maybe people don't like those options as much, but you can't sit there and go, oh my God, the Mets are screwed. They lost Pete Alonso. They have no other answers. That's the power of being able to move Vientos over and having some other answers at third base. So, and I almost think, Joe, we're at the point where, like, full transparency, I haven't been a huge Arenado guy because the decline is real, and I understand that. But I almost think we've gotten to the point where now it's gone too far with Arenado. Yes, he is going to be 34 during next season. And yes, he only hit 16 home runs last year. But this is still a guy that hit 272. He still plays an above average third base. So I'm not saying Arenado is a likely fix for the Mets in that scenario. But I'm just saying sometimes you begin to overvalue your in-house guys and you completely wipe away all the external options because you're just not ready to have that conversation yet. But I think the Mets have put emotion aside here and really care about the business aspect in all of this the most.
One thing I really wonder, Connor, and I think this is something that hasn't really been talked about a lot. What is the Mets' actual line in the sand on a Pete Alonso deal? They're not offering him 5 years or 6 years right now because there's no reason to offer him 5 years or 6 years. But we'll use the Giants as an example because Susan Slusser, who does a great job out there at the San Francisco Chronicle covering the Giants, and I believe she covers the A's as well, but covering, the Giants. And if she says there's some interest in Pete Alonso, then there is some interest in Pete Alonso from the Giants side of things. If the Giants come at 5 years and $120 million, are the Mets walking away? Are the Mets matching it? Are they going up a few $1 million and luring Pete Alonso back? So that's the one thing that I think the Mets know at this stage they have the leverage to do whatever they want with the Pete Alonso contract offer. I wonder what their true line in the sand is.
That's what everybody's kind of wondering, right? They're looking around thinking, how do you value the player for what he is going to do for you, not for what he's done? And I think That's the big conversation. And I think it just goes back to the Mets are in a fine spot here. You don't have to like it. You could be tired of the wait. You could not like how long this is dragged out. Even the biggest Pete fans, they just want him back no matter what. And I totally understand it. I'm fascinated, Joe. Do you think, opinion question here,
Yeah.
do you think it's good business or reaching the point of bad business, Pete dragging this out through spring training? Like, because in my opinion, and listen, Scott Boras, I would like to say, knows a lot more than me about this market. I don't see the drastic change that it sounds like they are holding on to, that, the Giants wake up one day and they go, you know what? It's February. We didn't get all our targets. Here's $140 million. And maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like there is what's the point for the Mets where you have to go and do something else, whether that's trading for Arenado, which is you're just taking on salary. I want to be clear to everybody. You're not giving up a real piece for Arenado. You're going out and getting Tony Taters, Anthony Santander, and you're going to figure out how to flex your lineup around. We know they were interested in Jock Peterson. Do you explore the DH market a little bit more heavier, or even look to bring back Jesse Winker? Like, at some point, the Mets need to add offense if Pete Alonso wants to carry this thing out to spring.
It's a very interesting spot for them to be, because if you want to talk about Alex Bregman, kind of tough to do the Alex Bregman, Pete Alonso game against each other because you're on the phone with the same agent. So you can't exactly, or at least it's probably hard to use Alex Bregman against Pete Alonso when you're talking to the agent for both of the players. But there has to be a point. When is that point? I don't know. Because there was an article in The Athletic with Will Salmon and Katie Wu from this morning or last night. I read it this morning, saying that, the Arenado market hasn't really developed. And even though they would like to move him, there's a chance that Arenado has to at least start the season back with the St. Louis Cardinals. So that hasn't really developed either. But if you're David Stearns, to me, you got to be operating in both lanes. And I think that's what he's been doing. As we talked about, Jock Peterson was someone that they pursued. He signed with the Texas Rangers. They made an offer to Teoscar Hernandez. He went back to the Dodgers. I think David Stearns has visions of adding 2 more bats. A DH kind of guy. And maybe that is Anthony Santander. Maybe that is Jesse Winker. And then you figure out the first base, third base conundrum. Still, like I said a few minutes ago, my gut still tells me, might be a few weeks from now, whatever the case may be, but we will be doing a show about Pete Alonso returning to the Mets. I still think that is the ultimate outcome. One thing that you have to account for is, you mentioned, and everyone talks about, moving Mark Vientos to first base. And that is a very legitimate option for the Mets to do. However, if you move Mark Vientos to first base now, you can't move him back to third base next year. He is now a first baseman. So if you're making that move, you're making that move. Or, maybe he's a DH after this year, whatever. But I think Vientos is a better fit at third base. He improved throughout the year. His best defensive trait is his throwing arm. So just get Pete Alonso back if you can. But man, the struggle is real, getting through this kind of lull and figuring out when and what the price point actually makes sense at.
And I'm sure the Mets will reach a point where, and I don't think it's going to be in the next week, but the Mets will reach a point where they call up Scott Boras and they're like, okay, where does this stand right now? Because at some point we have to make other moves,
right,
and set up this team. And you're right, Joe, you nailed it with Vientos. Like, that's one that you can't just leave it hanging and go into spring and be like, hey, Mark Vientos, guess what? You're here now. That's the worst thing you could do with a young player. That Vientos, there's a confidence layer there with Vientos. We have seen now what a confident Mark Vientos looks like, and it is everything you could ever dream of as a Mets fan. And we saw, when Buck Showalter didn't really have much interest in giving him a chance, what a player when Mark Vientos lacking confidence looked like. And I think this is a little bit of an exaggerated combo, because I think Vientos will be okay at the plate, whether he's playing third or first. But you're trying to foster an environment that is setting up young players for success. That is a massive goal of this organization right now. And they've done a lot of things behind the scenes, a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes to kind of build that environment. So speaking of which, this ties into Roki Sasaki, because listen, with Sasaki, a borderline pitching phenom, who, he's Joe shaking his head, which, it's good to get that confirmation. Sasaki this is a totally different pursuit because it's not about the money. He's somebody that is signed to an with international signing bonus money, which obviously limits the contract. We had a massive update from his agent, Joel Wolf, who has obviously represented Japanese pitchers in recent history, and
Yamamoto and Senga.
Right, Yamamoto and Senga. So he's dealt with the Mets throughout two massive negotiations already. We know the Mets are in on Sasaki. Here's a couple of things just to kind of recap what Wolf had to say after they've had these meetings, these in-person meetings with teams, him and Sasaki with teams. 20 teams reached out to Roki Sasaki with recruiting materials. That includes videos and books. Sasaki, who is obviously in charge of this process, like he's described as a very thoughtful, calculated guy. He asked that all the meetings are held at a neutral site. That's Wasserman Agency's LA offices. So this isn't, what we dreamed of with the Mets with Soto, where you get to go to one of the Steve Cohen estates, which worked out great, by the way. So this is all at a neutral site. He asked that no players attend meetings. So this is only, front office type people. He's now in Japan with his family. He's mulling through everything for a huge decision. He might meet with one or two more teams, and then the elimination process is going to begin. And the elimination process could be starting as soon as some of you are listening to this podcast, honestly. That's how early this could happen. Joel Wolf, his agent, does not expect that Sasaki will sign with the team when the international signing period begins on January 15th. He will probably make his decision somewhere down the line between that day and January 23rd, which is the deadline of him being posted. So he has to decide within that 8-day window.
He has to have pen to paper on the 23rd, just so people are aware. So that means physicals, all that stuff has to be done. I believe it's 5 p.m. I could be off on the exact time, but I believe it's 5 p.m. on the 23rd that Sasaki needs to be officially pen to paper, signed to whatever team he wants to be on. Otherwise, he goes back to Japan.
This last one, not shocking from Joel Wolf, but I think it's something you like to hear as a Mets fan. He said that he's driven to be the best, and he's prioritizing teams whose pitching programs will make him better. And I think when I hear that, Joe, I instantly think Dodgers, who've been rumored, Padres, who've been rumored, and it would be insane to say the Mets don't have a shot in this thing. What have your thoughts been on just how they built up their international signing poll in this era after being dormant for what feels like forever?
I think it is a credit to the investment that Steve Cohen has made behind the scenes. It's a credit to the work that Jeremy Hefner does. And I am very happy because I've been a Jeremy Hefner stan through the last 4 regimes that he's survived through. And now Jeremy Hefner is kind of getting, I would say, the credit that he's due. Eric Jager's down on the minor league side of things. The vice president of pitching is another fantastic hire. And you take this whole system together, and we're at the point now where 20 teams sent in PowerPoints, videos, books. What's he reading? But anyway, they sent in all their materials to Sasaki. And to our knowledge, he has met with 6 teams. And the Mets are one of those 6 teams. The Mets were the runner-up to getting Yoshinobu Yamamoto last year. The Mets brought in Kodai Senga. So their presence internationally is growing to the point where they are now a destination for these guys to at least consider. And I believe David Stern said last year, after the Yamamoto thing, hey, we learned a lot throughout this process, and we think it's, a good thing for the future. And, we'll get some of these guys, and we won't get some of them. So I'm not sure the Mets' chances here as far as getting Sasaki, but it's clear as day they are involved. And everything that he seems to be seeking, the Mets are a good fit for. And outside of just the international aspect of it, the perception of the Mets pitching development is impacting free agency here as well. Sean Manaea, I'm just going to guess, probably took a smaller deal than he's been offered this offseason to stay with the Mets. Frankie Montas signed with the Mets, and at his press conference or Zoom session, whatever, he talked about what he's heard about the Mets pitching staff, and he spoke to Severino, he spoke to Sean Manaea. It's this stuff. When these things start getting around baseball, it just changed the perception of the franchise. And whether the Mets get Sasaki or not, they're clearly one of the finalists, and they are setting themselves up for the next guy that comes. Maybe that's the guy the Mets get. So really good sign of things to come for the team.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, just obviously the goal of any franchise is you want to be able to add talent from every available avenue. And that's not always possible, right? Because, I mean, we obviously see these phenom Japanese pitchers, understandably so, really, really care about the situation they're going into, because we've discussed this with Senga, and I don't think he even got enough credit for it that first year. It's a life adjustment. There's a language barrier. There's a massive culture change. The pitching schedule. There are so many different things. So it's great to see the Mets once again. And even if there's times where it's like, hey, you guys are on the East Coast, my client doesn't want to go there, he wants to play on the West Coast, that's fine. But at least you're trying. And you can't sit here and go, well, the Mets are out of luck. It's never going to work because they're an East Coast team. Because they got Senga. And Senga, yeah, he missed last year, but he was a good signing. Senga was phenomenal his first year, and he's expected to be a huge part of the rotation this year. So I'm with you all the way. It's been one of the biggest aspects for the better with this regime. All right, continuing the theme kind of young players here. Let's go down on the farm, Joe, because you wrote a really good piece on SNY.TV this week. It was 5 prospects who can actually make an impact this year, not guys that are expected to be buried in the minors all year. Of course, you kick things off with Brandon Sproat, who's the most notable arm in the Mets system right now, and just a massive 2023 in 2024. What do you think the timeline now becomes for Sproat here, Joe? Because we know the stuff is in order, but you would assume, as you wrote in the piece, he's going to get a pretty good look at Syracuse to start the season and kind of take things from there. Maybe similar to Christian Scott last year?
That's exactly what I was going to say, Connor. I think it's a similar trajectory to what Christian Scott was on. Sproat still has a few things he needs to clean up at the AAA level because, look, he dominated Brooklyn, dominated Binghamton, and he went to Syracuse, and that was his first speed bump as a professional, which every young player is going to have it at some point. And the AAA level is unique. You get a different baseball for the first time. The strike zone is different because you have the automatic ball strike challenge system in place. So pitches that were just off the plate in AA that you got the call on, you're not getting the call on in AAA. So it was a bit of an adjustment for him, but from a pure stuff standpoint, this is a guy that was a second-round pick in the 2023 draft, kind of as a project of sorts where it's really raw stuff, but you really have to put the package together to becoming, for me, the number 2 prospect in the system, for others, the number 1, consensus top 100, one of the better pitching prospects in the sport. So I think he's on the trajectory to start in AAA Syracuse, and I think he finds his way by June, maybe to the big leagues. And with the uncertainty, I would say, on the back end of the rotation with the Mets right now, it almost feels like they're setting up and leaving a spot open for someone like Sproat to make an impact.
Yeah, and especially we always discuss just the amount of arms you go throughout a major league season.
Mets use 35.
That was the best nugget of the article. When I read that, I was like, yeah, I believe it, but it's still jarring when you see it on paper. All right, so the only position player on the list was Drew Gilbert. Not really a shock there. Gilbert, Joe, I think we both thought, hey, if he didn't get hurt last year, he was a guy that we might have even saw at the end of last year. Do you think that he's somebody that if he has a big spring and kind of carries it into AAA, this is the wait and see scenario? Because we like Tyrone Taylor as the 4th or 5th outfielder on this team. Jose Siri was a no-brainer acquisition, and those guys give you an incredible floor defensively. Like, you are getting plus defense with those guys out there. But the inconsistency with them at the plate, Joe, center field feels like the door could be open if Gilbert can find a way to kind of, I don't want to say run away with it because I don't think he would get it out of spring training.
No.
But it wouldn't shock me if we saw Drew Gilbert out in center field for the Mets in July.
Look, Connor, I wrote this same article last year, and Drew Gilbert was in the article last year. So obviously he had the hamstring injury that he suffered in April and had a couple setbacks and got into 56 games, I think it was, or 52 games at the AAA level. He went to the Arizona Fall League. He posted an OPS just under 800 there, hit a few home runs, had more walks than strikeouts. I think if he has a solid spring training, goes to AAA Syracuse and performs like you and I and many in the industry think Drew Gilbert's capable of, I think he can earn a call up to be a center field option. As you said, Jose Siri has been, I would say, inconsistent would be a nice word to say for his offensive game. Tyrone Taylor, I think, best profiles as a, like you said, fourth outfielder type. The only question with Drew Gilbert, there are some evaluators that I spoke to recently that think maybe he's not quite the center fielder that we thought he was, and he might fit more as a corner outfielder. That makes it a little complicated, but I think the Mets will give him, as I wrote in the article, every opportunity to show that he is a true center fielder. And I think, by midsummer, there's no reason why Drew Gilbert can't earn an opportunity to get at least some at-bats in center field.
All right, so 3 more players on this piece, all pitchers, and kind of fascinated by all of them, Joe. I'll give the brief rundown on all 3. You could talk about all 3 or pick one out that you think has the most likely chance to wear a Mets uniform at Citi Field this year. Blade Tidwell, 2022 second-round pick for the Mets. He was really stellar through most levels of minor leagues. He was phenomenal in Double-A to start the season. He just hit a wall in Triple-A last year. I mean, you wrote an 85 innings, 5.93 ERA, so we're assuming he's going to start down there. Nolan McLean, Cowboy Ohtani, one of our favorite prospects on this entire show, full-time pitcher now. I know you wrote that he has the best pitch in the Mets system, that 70-grade sweeper. Maybe long-term a reliever, maybe not, but somebody that could be knocking on the door. And then Jonathan Pintero, who I'll actually let you take the floor fully on this one, Joe, because he's the total wild card of this. Like, this guy truly came out of nowhere.
Yeah. So, Connor, I'm pulling up the article just so I make sure I don't say anything. But Tidwell, I think everyone knows about Tidwell and everyone knows about McLean. Let's talk about Pintero. He had a crazy 2024. He was pitching an independent ball, and on June 2nd, he was pitching for the Glacier Range Riders of the Pioneer League.
My favorite team in the Pioneer League.
Of course. Who doesn't want to go to Kalispell, Montana to watch some baseball? So he was there, and in the middle of his start, they started warming someone up after a couple innings, and he was just like, pitching fine. Well, why are we warming anyone up? Well, it's because the Mets called and wanted to purchase his contract. And June 6th, he makes his professional debut with High A Brooklyn, makes his way all the way up to AAA Syracuse. By the end of the season, he made 1 appearance in the middle of September, and the Mets sent him to the Arizona Fall League, where he pitched fine in 10 1/3 innings there. He's a guy that it's not the same as what Grant Hartwig was, but it reminds me a little bit of that story where it's a kind of a guy out of nowhere. And he really didn't learn what he was doing until he went to the MLB Draft League. He never had access to TrackMan or any of that information. He just knew how fast he threw. That was it. Kind of old school. But he has a 4-pitch mix. Fastball top out at 96. He really emphasizes his cutter. And he has a sweeper and a changeup, so that way he has something to give a look to left-handers and something to get away from or go in on right-handers. He's a starter so far. I think people believe he's probably a reliever at the next level. And as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, Mets used 35 pitchers in 2024. Pintaro will probably start with AAA Syracuse. And if he pitches well there, I could totally see a guy going from Kalispell, Montana last June to Queens sometime this summer.
What an unbelievable story that would be. And by the way, just looking at Glacier Bank Stadium, which is where the Range Riders play, the MLB should look into doing their next Field of Dreams style series here, because it's really just trees and land all
Yeah.
around this, but it is unbelievable looking, and we'll see if Pintaro can make it all the way to Citi Field. We'll see. But really good piece from Joe. If you want to read the full thing, you get a lot more information. It's on SNY.TV, so check it out there. You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. In the spirit of the new year, Joe, we got resolutions. We're going to do one Mets one and one personal one here, Joe. What do you got as your Mets resolution?
My Mets resolution is a healthy season for Kodai Senga. All we see is the Mets need an ace. The Mets need an ace. The Mets don't have an ace. Well, if you could get a healthy season of Kodai Senga, he pitched like an ace in 2023 when he posted a 2.98 ERA in 29 starts. That's, I think, the most optimal thing you could ask for from a Met in 2025 is give me a full season of Kodai Senga, and the Mets rotation looks dramatically different than it does just perceptually as you look at the rotation on paper.
My Mets won, and I think they're in a really good place with this already. But as we've learned in previous years, I'd like them to try to tie up as many loose ends this offseason instead of playing the game they've done the last couple of years. I understand it. If we need bullpen arms at the deadline, we'll get them. If we need a DH at the deadline, we'll get them. What we've learned in recent years is the prices for those things are so outrageous, and you're not going to nail every bullpen signing you make. You might not hit on your DH signing, but I'd like to see the Mets the Mets. Juan Soto's here. The Mets are going for it now. The Mets are going for a World Series every year with Juan Soto here. I would like to see them. I understand they have young arms that could help out in the bullpen, but I'd really like to see them add a high-profile arm or two. I'd like to see them, if it's not bringing back Jesse Winker, have a solution at DH. Even if that's them committing, I've said in the past, I like Starling Marte at DH if that's the route you have to go, and then see where that goes as well. Just tie up those loose ends because, Joe, quite frankly, one, you're going to have to make a move at the deadline anyway because people get hurt, and those are things you can't predict. I don't want to also have to make the move to the deadline for things I didn't want to buy in the winter because, man, Joe, you look at these, not only the prices for relievers and starting pitchers just so outrageous right now, but the success rate when guys move over to a new team, it's not always pretty. It's a tough transition in the middle of the season for a lot of these guys. And listen, easier said than done for me to throw that at David Stearns, but I'd really, really love to see them round out this team as much as possible these next 6 weeks.
Buy things when it just costs money instead of money and prospects. I'm totally with you, Connor. I was thinking big picture throughout the whole 2025, but your resolution has big picture like ramifications surrounding it. And there are so many relievers that are out there in free agency. The reliever market has barely even been touched this winter. So I think it's an interesting kind of big picture conversation where it feels like the sport is catching up to the fact that giving these massive contracts to relievers is not a great idea. And you're going to see, I think, more and more teams wait out the reliever market and just extract as much value as possible when you get into mid-January, late January, and into February.
All right, Joe, how about a personal resolution?
Yeah, so I think about this pretty often. Like, am I going to work out more? Probably not. Unless I get a invite to the famous Rogers home gym.
It's open for you, my friend.
The only problem is I'd have to brave the Stamford traffic on the way, and I don't know if
Not worth it.
Yeah, I don't know if it's worth it. But working out more, unlikely, though. Maybe I'll be a little more active.
You play enough golf.
I play enough golf, and the golf cart really works on my leg when I'm pushing the gas up and down. But one thing I will say is I think it is sickening how much screen time I have on my phone.
That's a good one.
I had to turn off that notification. I don't want to tell you what my screen time was, but I want to spend maybe less time on the phone. And I've gotten into reading some books a little bit, maybe read more books and do less just hate scrolling on Twitter and going through Instagram reels and things like that. Instead of wasting time on that, maybe do a little more like reading and learning about something. because Connor, I'm going to tell you this. I learned at the SNY holiday party that the perception of me is all I care about is this. And while that is
There are
true,
rumors.
yeah, but while that is true, or at least partially true, perhaps I could broaden my horizons a little bit and just learn something about something in this world.
No, it's a good one, and they all tie together. I try, and I fail at this when, football season's going on, because the last thing I do before I go to bed is typically watching a game, especially when you wake up and talk about it on a show in the morning. But like reading before bed is absolutely a phenomenal resolution. It helps you sleep better. It's more productive. You're off the phone. I kind of align with you on that one, but I'll tie in one as well that also it's a personal one, but also a Mets one, and I hope a lot of Mets fans are able to do this year. I honestly want to get out to Citi Field more this year. And last year, and it gets tricky, right? Because I go through, when the season starts, I'm in the peak of NFL draft mode, and then when the playoffs are going on in the September, like the pennant race is going on, I'm working for football 6 days a week, but with Juan Soto there, all the excitement around the Mets, and we're really lucky, Joe, with SNY, we get to do a couple live shows from Citi Field. So we go to Citi Field no matter what, multiple times every single year. We were at one of the Yankee games last year, which it felt like the Mets were hitting a home run every other at bat.
They
Every
did.
time
It was
we looked
great.
up, it was
lit
phenomenal.
up Garrett Cole.
Yeah, it was an absolute joy for us to be to do a live show there. But more like leisurely, we do the live show, which is a ton of fun. We get to meet people, and then we watch the game. But even just not have a reason to go is kind of my goal. Just get out there, hang out at the ballpark. This team is going to be a lot of fun this year. And when the ballpark is rocking, when this team is really relevant, and they are, it's a special place to be. So that's a Mets one that's mixed in with the personal one. All right, let's get into some mailbag questions here. Thank you to Egan for the 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. I had a thought on a potential starting pitching option I feel like is not being talked about enough. Early reporting in the offseason said the Twins were looking to slash payroll due to their local TV situation. What if the Mets made a move for Pablo Lopez? Might be able to get him for not too much of a return if they take on the full contract, but curious to hear your thoughts. I'm going to pull up his contract as you are kind of thinking on Lopez here, Joe.
Yeah, I looked up his contract because I saw reports that they were at least listening on Pablo Lopez. The reality is, with the pitching market as it is, I believe, Connor, correct me, because I know you're pulling it up now. I think he's making something like 21, 22 a year.
Yeah, right between there. It's 21.75 for the next 3. So counting this year, the next 3 years. The luxury tax hit is 18.375.
Taking on the contract does nothing. If Pablo Lopez were a free agent, he would get a bigger contract than what he's getting paid by the Minnesota Twins. So while I think Pablo Lopez is a great fit for the rotation, I think ever since he got moved to Minnesota, he's become, one of the more reliable pitchers in the sport. It's not a value where it's like the idea of Luis Castillo 2 months ago to us was, he's getting a little older. The stuff has kind of regressed a tick, but he's still good. But then you just see what all these pitchers are signing for, and all of a sudden you're like, well, that Luis Castillo contract looks pretty good. Right. So now these things aren't the value that we think they are. Would I talk to the Twins about Pablo Lopez? Sure. But I don't think this is something where you go, we'll take that $18 million a year off your hand for your very good, reliable pitcher and give you nothing. It'll cost you a pretty penny.
It's a great idea by Egan. This is a really good question, because I've somehow never seen Pablo Lopez's name brought up this offseason. And to Joe's point, it's more than a salary dump. Like it's funny because you look at it face value and you go, did Lopez have a down year in 2024? Because for the first time since 19, like literally 5 years ago, he had an ERA over 4. He had a 4.08 ERA. But when you look at the underlying stuff, like you said, I mean, he's still striking out almost 10 guys over 9. He was 15-10. He had a 2.5 WAR. He made all 32 starts. And Castillo's 32. Lopez is turning 29 in March. So I'm all for it. And I would even give up something to get him. But yeah, you're right. It's probably not as simple as they're just shedding. Man, that would be a travesty if the Twins just give away a guy like that.
Yeah, that one to me, that if the Twins want to cut salary, I think there's other options that they could look at on the roster where they could dump some money. Lopez would be a true like a legitimate trade where they get a legitimate return and the Mets get in exchange a legitimate pitcher.
Dave Stevens 7377. This one's from YouTube. If the Mets go to a 6-man rotation, doesn't that mean they have to carry one less position player? Aren't they essentially deciding to add another pitcher and they still need to carry the same number of bullpen arms because they will need them? Does that make their bench shorter? No, right, Joe?
No, it's the opposite, actually.
Right.
You would carry the same amount of position players. You would actually end up carrying one less reliever, which I think would emphasize having guys like Jose Butto, having guys like Griffin Canning in the bullpen, having multi-inning options. I think you're going to need more of those because the cap is on how many pitchers you can have on your roster. And if you add an additional starting pitcher, then you just naturally have to subtract a reliever. So it wouldn't have any impact on the bench. The impact would be you have one less reliever, which would be an interesting decision for the Mets on how they want to construct this pitching staff as a whole.
This one from TB. If the Mets can't come to agreements with Bregman and Alonso, who do you think they turn to next? Santander, trade market? Do you think there's a possibility of bringing in a combo of two bats? So we kind of opened the show a little bit with this. Joe, you said you think two bats anyway. I brought up that, don't completely rule out Arenado. Don't write it off entirely. Santander is somebody that he hits a lot of home runs, and he'd add power to this lineup. Do you think there's anything else, Joe? And by the way, I align with you. I would be really surprised if one of Bregman or Pete is not a Met, and I would be very surprised if it's not Pete at this point, especially with the qualifying offer cost of Bregman. But yeah, the Mets would be very aggressive, I think, if they didn't get one of these guys.
I feel pretty confident it will not be Alonso and Bregman. I don't think that's in the cards.
Shock.
Yeah, I don't think the Mets want to just make Mark Vientos a DH, and I know that'll drive some people crazy, but I don't think that's something that they particularly want to do at this time. Maybe that's something you look into in the future, but you also have other guys that you're going to have to consider DH reps for in the future. But I do believe two bats are on the radar. The proof is kind of in the pudding because they've pursued DH type of guys. Anthony Santander, to me, he's basically a DH at this stage. His defense is well below average, and he would be in a corner, and then you'd have to shift Brandon Nimmo back to center, and that would not be a good defensive outfield, and that goes
against Stearns' beliefs.
Bingo. It goes against what everything Stearns believes. But if you can add 4, I don't think Santander will probably hit 40 home runs again, but let's just call it a 30 to 35 home run bat as your designated hitter. That's an enticing option. And one thing that stands out from their pursuit of Teoscar Hernandez is I always thought the Mets were going to be avoiding signing 2 qualifying offer free agents. They clearly don't care about that because they offered Teoscar a contract. So I think Santander has to be on the table. I think Bregman is probably I don't think Bregman's in the same situation as Alonso where he's going to have to settle for a shorter contract at some point. I think he's going to get that long-term big money deal from somebody that's probably not the Mets. But Arenado, Alonso, Santander, Winker, those are some of the names to keep an eye on, I think.
All right, our last question for today, and this is definitely an interesting one. It's been a couple weeks since this happened, but from Matty Rolls, are you surprised by the harsh criticism of Jeff Passan and Buster Olney on the Mets signing of Soto? I feel like any other team, they would be heaping praise on that organization for getting their guy. It just seems odd to me. So this was in about the middle of December for those that missed it. And essentially the recap was there's the Baseball Tonight with Buster Olney podcast that Jeff Passan went on, who is, I think, undeniably the best baseball insider in the game right now. I mean, he broke, though it's arguable who broke the Soto signing. It felt like it was a tie between a lot of people, but national wise, Jeff is phenomenal. So, that holds a lot of weight. But after it, when they did this podcast, basically So Buster said, do we really believe that either Brian Cashman or David Stearns is saying to their owner, you know what, it's a good baseball deal to give this guy $51 million when we know he's probably going to be a DH for the most of his career? There's no chance that happens. This is all about the two owners. And then Jeff said, it's kind of amazing that the Yankees lost out on Soto and might be better off at the end of the day. And Buster said, oh, totally. And basically they were just going on that the baseball people would never believe this is a good deal. I mean, Joe, what do you think of this? Buster, only anytime he speaks about the Mets, nothing surprises me in terms of how low things typically go.
I mean, I didn't hear this, so this is really kind of news to me, to kind of what they said.
Yeah.
Look, it's probably not the best baseball deal ever. We're good, but
no one's
that
saying
is
that.
Yeah, but that is a problem a long time from now. And if the words were that Juan Soto is going to be a DH for most of this contract, I would disagree. I think he can play right field. He is not a fantastic right fielder. I'm not going to pretend
he's not Lucas Duda though. Let's get away from pretending that this is Lucas Duda in the outfield.
I think it's been taken a step too far. He's got a really good throwing arm, so he fits in right field. He will make the occasional pretty good play, and the low lights are there. Trust me, they've been tweeted at me a million times ever since the Mets gave Juan Soto this contract. But the reality is, I'm not concerned with things like this where it's, would David Stearns have signed up for this? I don't think David Stearns was fighting Steve Cohen like, please don't give this contract to Juan Soto. Like, he's probably like, hey, this is a little much, but look, when it comes down to these kind of deals, this is the way this sport works. This is where the owners come to play. And that's where Hal Steinbrenner came in. That's where Steve Cohen came in. And look, Juan Soto chose the Mets over the Yankees for a nominal sum of money and a suite and, whatever other perks are kind of thrown in there. I'm not concerned with people's opinions of, was this a good baseball move or not a good baseball move? To me, it's Juan Soto is one of the very best hitters in the sport, and he is a New York Met, and he hasn't theoretically entered his prime yet. If he is a problem when he is 37 years old, I'm willing to deal with that 11 years from now. So I get what they're saying, and sure, like, if the Mets didn't get Soto, they could have spent the money elsewhere and built a different type of team.
On what?
I don't know, but they could have. Yeah, like, it's just one of those things that this was a no-brainer move for the Mets to me I don't care about stealing so much the thunder from the Yankees, but it adds a little bit of value. This is getting a franchise cornerstone on a trajectory to be an easy first ballot Hall of Fame type of player, and we're concerning ourselves with the baseballness of the contract. Get out of here.
Yes. So my advice when people get, bothered by this stuff, it almost goes back to your New Year's resolution to bring this show full circle at the end, is that one, I think they were on a podcast and it's a casual laughing conversation. Like, it's nothing to be like, they're not like getting on television and pointing at the TV and laughing at the Mets. Now, I mean, I think Buster takes his shots at the Mets when he can. Admittedly, I think when the signing was announced, Jeff Passan was one of the first people on Twitter saying how much of a colossal seismic move this was.
And he wrote a really long article on ESPN why the Mets are going to be like the next great team in the sport. So,
which was phenomenal.
I think Passan was maybe like a touch tongue in cheek, maybe, because he wouldn't write that long article and then also go and flame the Mets for signing Juan Soto.
Right. So I think also, if you are a fan of a team, right, more so than the sport, and I think all of us are very in the Mets, bubble a lot.
Yeah.
It goes back to your point about doom scrolling, Joe. You can always find people trying to laugh at your team, even after they just did something that should make you the happiest fan on planet Earth. You can go find that person. Now, it's a little bit more notable because these people work for ESPN. Maybe so, because that's a massive, massive platform. It's not just like a person on TikTok showing you Juan Soto dropping a fly ball and saying you're screwed for the next 15 years. But I think the point is, we do live in a world now where, for better or for worse, everybody has a platform, and that means every opinion exists, to the point of, You can find any take you want out there. And as a fan, what I'm learning is if you actually want to enjoy being a fan, it's good to be less online in those instances. It really is. Like, you listen to the people that you really respect and like, or whether it's a podcast, a YouTube show, whatever it is, you turn on those personalities with TV. You watch Gary, Keith, and Ron talk about the Mets every day and Gelbs, and it's just a much more enjoyable experience because you're not sitting there and letting somebody else make you angry. So that it ties into the whole New Year's resolution of this entire thing. Who the hell cares if Buster Olney's laughing at the Mets signing Juan Soto? Everybody that's a Mets fan should be jumping for joy, and I think most importantly, they are.
Hey, Connor, everyone, here's the life advice for you. Be a little less online unless it is leaving 5-star reviews for the Mets pod with your questions for the mailbag, whether it's voting for us for best baseball podcast on Sports Podcast Awards, whether it's subscribing to the Mets pod, whether it's subscribing to SNY's YouTube channel and watching the Mets pod. You could avoid being online except for those things.
You don't ever have to log off if you're just rotating those things that you're doing.
That's perfect.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. If you want to ask us a question like the ones we read in today's mailbag, just leave a 5-star review and we'll get it on the show. If you don't have an Apple account or don't want to go through that process, we do scan through the YouTube comments on SNY as well. Those are a little bit, there's a lot more to scan through there. So we don't always get to all of them, but we get to as many as we can. So just make sure you're a subscriber over there as well. And make sure you're a subscriber so you never miss a show. Because we do emergency podcast. Sean Mania was back. That was supposed to be our 1 week off of the year. We said, forget it. Sean Mania is back. Emergency pod. Fire it up for Christmas week. Hope everybody had a great holidays and a happy new year. We're going to wrap up 2024 with this. Let's go Mets. Let's go Mets pod at sportspodcastawards.com and have a happy and healthy new year. We will see you next week in 2025.